If you work in HVAC, you know this tool is an absolute must-have. This is the Manifold gauge set, and it's pretty much the only way to know what's really going on inside a cooling system. So whether you're a seasoned pro or you're just wondering how your AC actually works, you're going to want to understand this. Let's dive in.
Okay, so just think about it for a second. Your air conditioner is a totally sealed, closed-loop system. All this refrigerant is just circulating round and round, constantly changing pressure, changing temperature. So the big question is, how in the world do you figure out what's happening on the inside without literally tearing the whole thing apart?
While you use this, the Manifold gauge set. And calling it a stethoscope is the perfect analogy, really. It lets a technician listen in on the system's vital signs, the pressures, what the refrigerant is doing, all without ever breaking that critical seal. It's a window into the health of the machine.
So how does this thing actually work? I know, at first glance, it looks kind of complicated, maybe a little intimidating with all the hoses and dials. But once you break it down, you'll see the design is actually incredibly smart and straightforward. Let's take a look at its anatomy.
Right at the center of it all, you have the manifold body. It holds two gauges. The blue one on the left, that's for the low pressure side of the system, what we call the suction side. And the red one on the right, that's for the high pressure or discharge side. And below them, you've got these two hand valves. They're not just for reading pressure, they're what let a technician control refrigerant flow when they need to charge a system.
And of course, that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, the hoses. They're how you connect the manifold to the AC unit itself. And that color coding isn't just for looks, it's a universal standard, and it's all about safety and making sure you don't make a very big, very expensive mistake.
And here it is, laid out plain and simple. Blue is for the low pressure side. Just think blue for cold. It connects to the larger insulated pipe that's bringing cool refrigerant gas back to the compressor. Red is for the high pressure side. Think red for hot. That's the smaller, hotter pipe. And that yellow hose in the middle? That's your utility line. It's for everything else, adding refrigerant, pulling a vacuum on the system, you name it. This color code is a lifesaver. All right, so we know what all the parts are. Now for the fun part. How do we actually hook it up and see what's going on? Let's walk through the basic process of connecting the gauges to get a reading.
Now, the process itself is pretty straightforward, but you gotta do every step right. First, you need to turn the AC on and let it run for a few minutes. You need to see what the pressures are when it's actually working, not when it's just sitting there. Then, and this is important, with the valves on your manifold closed, you connect blue to the low side port and red to the high side port. Once they're on, you open the little couplers at the end of the hoses, not the manifold valves, and that lets the refrigerant flow into the gauges. And boom, you're getting live readings.
Now here is a golden rule, an absolute non-negotiable tip that every single good technician lives by. Before you ever open that refrigerant tank to charge a system, you have to purge the air from that yellow hose. It's just like the quote says. If you don't, you're literally injecting air and moisture, we call them non-condensables, right into that sealed system. And that is a surefire way to cause some serious damage. So we figured out how to hook everything up and read the pressure, right? The PSI, on those blue and red gauges. But here's the big secret. The thing that separates the pros from the amateurs, HVAC diagnosis isn't really about pressure at all. Those numbers on the dial, they're just clues. They're telling you something way more important. I love this quote from an old school tech because it just hits the nail on the head. So why does temperature matter more? Because pressure and temperature are directly linked. The whole science of how refrigeration works is about managing the boiling and condensation points of that refrigerant. And the pressure reading on your gauge, it's simply telling you the exact temperature at which that change is happening. That's the key to everything. And that leads us to our first huge concept, superheat. The easiest way to think about it is with water, right? Water boils at 212 degrees and turns into steam. Well, if you keep heating that steam up to, say, 222 degrees, you've just added 10 degrees of superheat. We do the exact same thing in an AC system to make absolutely sure that only pure vapor, no liquid droplets, makes it back to the compressor. A compressor is built to pump gas. If you send liquid into it, you will destroy it. Superheat is its bodyguard. So, on the other side of the coin, we have subcooling. And again, with our water analogy, this is like cooling liquid water below its condensation point of 212 degrees. In an AC system, subcooling is how we guarantee that we're sending a solid, stable column of liquid refrigerant to the part that does the cooling. No bubbles, no vapor, just pure liquid ready to absorb as much heat as possible. It's all about maximizing the system's efficiency.
So now that we get what superheat and subcooling are all about, we can look back at our gauges and see a whole lot more than just numbers. We can start to see a story unfolding. We can start to decode what these different combinations of high and low pressure are really telling us about what's going on inside that system. This chart is basically a diagnostic decoder ring. For instance, if you see that both your low side and your high side pressures are low, that's the classic symptom of a low refrigerant charge. The system's running out of juice. But what if the low side is low, but the high side is screaming high? Well, that tells you there's a restriction somewhere. Pressure's building up because it can't get through. And if both are high, you might have way too much refrigerant in there, or maybe the outdoor unit is just so dirty it can't get rid of the heat. See, every pair of readings tells a different story. You know, for decades, those classic analog gauges were the one and only tool for the job. But technology does what technology does. It marches on. The fundamental principles we just talked about, they haven't changed one bit. But the tools we use to measure them, oh yeah, they've definitely changed. This chart really shows that evolution perfectly. We started with the simple, reliable analog gauges, but you had to do all the math in your head or on a chart. Then came the digital manifolds, which were a game changer. They're more accurate, and they do all those superheat and subcooling calculations for you. And now you see a lot of techs using wireless probes that beam all the data right to a phone or tablet. But what's the pattern here? The tools get smarter and slicker, but the goal is always the same. You're just measuring pressure to understand temperature.
And all of this progress brings us to one last, really interesting question to chew on. As our tools get smarter and smarter, doing the math for us, logging the data, does understanding the fundamentals, like why superheat and subcooling are so critical, become more important or less? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this one.